Today, we're going to talk through the results from the Great American Taste Test. Now, if you missed this, this was a giant taste test experiment that we did. We could only do it with people in America, so that's why it's called the Great American Taste Test. What we did is we shipped people 4 different coffees. We worked with combatia, so they were extracted coffees, which meant that they melted and diluted the little ice cubes of coffee down, and it meant that everyone who tasted had theoretical and identical tasting experience. And I think this might be the largest preference test done of this nature ever, but I can't imagine there's been that many sort of taste tests done like this where everyone's drinking identical extractions. We put 4 different coffees in this pack, and I'll explain why we chose these 4 coffees, and then we asked 3 main questions. I'll give you the results of those questions, including which one was the most popular. And then we asked a few more details that gave us some more insights that I think are super, super interesting. The first question we wanted to ask, we used coffees A, B, and C, and ultimately we were trying to get to the bottom of how preference around roast level was established. So coffee A was a light roasted coffee, it was a coffee from Kenya. Coffee B was a blend, it was a medium roast, and coffee C was also a blend and a dark roast. And we thought that was a good question to ask to establish kind of where preference lies. Now, we'll talk more about the audience and the particular demographics that we got to. Obviously, 4,000 is a big number, but also a very tiny number. And so it's the preference of this audience, and we can't necessarily map it entirely onto the entire US population. For context here, the National Coffee Association's National Coffee Data Trends Report for fall 2023 used 1,543 respondents, though I will say they were obviously much more sort of representative demographically of the US population than perhaps our data set was. Then there was a question that was coffee A versus coffee D. Now, coffee D was a single estate coffee. It was an experimental process, an unusual variety from Colombia. It was quite a strongly fermented coffee. People would describe it as kind of funky potentially. And coffee A was a washed Kenyan coffee. And we were trying to establish how people felt about kind of fermented flavors in coffee. Then at the end, we asked of A, B, C, D, which was your favorite? Let's get to those results straight away. Between coffee A, B, C, light, medium, and dark roast, which was the most popular? This will probably be no surprise to viewers of this channel, but the most popular coffee was coffee A in this grouping, which was the light roasted coffee. It had 45% of the votes here. But coffee B and coffee C each had 27, 28%, so really very close between those two, an almost identical number of respondents actually, quite an even distribution of preference that I thought was really very interesting. But then move on to coffee A versus coffee D. Which one do you prefer? And here, it went to coffee D. It edged it out. It had 54% of the votes versus 46, so not a big sort of difference there. But, and this was interesting, when you asked people which was their favorite between all of them, coffee D won out pretty substantially. It got 37% of the total vote, and then, interestingly again, coffees A, B, and C received near identical numbers of votes for them, each getting 21 to 22% of the vote. This alone, though, does not truly tell the story of coffee D, and we're going to go back to this because I think it's one of the most important lessons from this tasting is around this kind of very fermented, very unusual coffee that was very popular, but that does not tell you everything. The first thing we should talk about is the kind of gender split amongst this particular demographic. 72% of respondents said male, 24% said female, 3% non-binary, and 1% declined to answer. And I think that definitely skews some of the data. And when we get into some of the preferences a little bit more, you'll see what I mean. As for age, this one was interesting as well. Very heavily dominant in the 25 to 34-year-olds. Now, we did have respondents above 65 years old and actually some under 18 years old, so there was a little bit of a spread around there. But I would say that, well, over 75% of respondents are between 25 and 44 years old. And I would say this is an area where there's really a lot of crossover with the YouTube channel in terms of demographics, in terms of people who typically watch the videos and people who participated in this taste test. And then one more piece of information was asked was zip code, so we can show you a kind of distribution of respondents by state. I had been curious if there would be kind of insights based on different states. We did actually look at whether there were preferences varying by urban, suburban, and rural zip codes, and the answer is Not really, not significantly anyway, but it was still interesting to see a kind of distribution of people from all across the mainland United States. We did also ask respondents briefly about some of their coffee drinking habits, and some of those I think are worth looking at. Most obviously, we'd asked them, how much coffee do you drink a day? And the results maybe are kind of surprising. There's a real peak at 1 to 2 cups of coffee a day. I would have thought viewers of a YouTube channel like this one, people participating in something like this, would be perhaps heavy coffee drinkers. That doesn't seem to be the case, which is really quite interesting. I feel like people are probably more aware of coffee consumption than ever. I know my own consumption is lower, much lower than it used to be, but I was surprised to see 2 be the most popular answer here when that question was asked. We asked people how they brew coffee at home, and this one was maybe kind of surprising to me too. The most popular answer here by far was pour over. 63% of respondents said they make a pour over at home, which is really quite a lot. Espresso came in second, 42% of people making espresso at home. So this to me is kind of surprising. I've got this group of people who don't drink that much coffee but have definitely invested in their home setup. I always presume people who drink espresso at home maybe drank more coffee. Maybe that was a stupid thing for me to presume. This is definitely insightful. I was pleased to see the French press in there at 20%, a popular brewer, and rightfully so, and then a pretty even distribution of other things. 9% using some sort of pod system, 4% instant coffee, some, using bean-to-cup machines, though not many. And if you consider how many bean-to-cups are out there, that's maybe an audience in future will be interesting to kind of access that we didn't really access here. Cold brew also surprisingly popular, but only to me because I live in a cold, wet place and never really think about cold brew that way. Now, one interesting question that I really like is we asked people to rank from 0 to 10 their level of coffee expertise. We didn't really give guidance here, and so there's a broad range of results. There's a real peak at sort of 6 to 8. People who answered 6 and 7, 5 and 8 also popular. There's a kind of clustering there. There are people that answered 10 and there are people that answered 1. And that data is really useful when we look at it later because it shows something really cool. So let's talk about Coffee D, because this one definitely interesting and not hugely surprising to me that this unusual, funky, fruity coffee came out on top. It was, I think clear and unusual and different and kind of fun. And I think a lot of people gravitated towards that. And so you'd say, okay, people really like naturals, but that does not tell the whole story. If you look at the preference data for coffees A, B, and C, you'll see they're all actually quite similar. They have a peak in the middle and then they decline at either side. Some people really liked them, some people didn't. Most people were kind of like, yeah, okay. Coffee D is sort of the opposite of that. Yes, it has a lot of I really like this, but it also has the most I really dislike this. So the key lesson here is that D was popular, but highly, highly polarizing. And actually, more interesting still, when you break that coffee down by gender response, it gets really interesting. Now, we only have enough data to split it out into people who said male or female, but this was a coffee strongly preferred by men and actually strongly disliked by women. And that is very surprising. I had assumed that preference was kind of agnostic in this particular regards, but it seems in this test not. And if you look at the data, there's some really different distributions of preference. I think that's really notable. There is a clear implication for this, which is if you serve these kind of coffees, that's great. They're really useful. And if you serve naturals and promote naturals, that's really useful. People really do like these kind of flavors, but this should not be on a kind of default option. If you serve batch brew, do not put natural processed coffees that taste kind of funky and fermented on your batch brew, because there is a good chance that a decent portion of your audience will not enjoy that coffee. They just don't like those kind of flavors. Now, this is, I think, a reasonably good reflection of kind of the American population. I've seen this when we've done previous tastings in other populations too. It's not uniform. There are certain populations in different parts of the world that have a much higher appreciation and a broader acceptance of very funky and kind of fermented flavors. But I would say if you're in the US, I would say probably the same is in the UK from the data that I've seen in previous tastings. It's not a default option. If you want to do a natural on batch brew, you just need an option that isn't that. You just can't presume that everyone will like this. I think, looking at kind of the washed coffee as a kind of counterpart to this, no one really disliked it. Even as much as maybe less people really liked it, no one was disappointed or upset by it. And I think that's the lesson here, which is those kind of coffees are very, very useful. I think there's definitely a market for them, but but it's not everyone. Diving a little deeper into this, I almost wanted to say something about the sort of age differences here, because if we look at preference by sort of age, it's really interesting, and there's two potential explanations of this. As you look at the data here, you'll see that coffee D in younger demographics is much, much more popular. And as you cross kind of 45 into 50 into 60 years old, it gets less and less and less popular. And darker roasts get more and more and more popular. Thinking about this, I can offer two potential explanations, and I'll tell you which one is my favorite. Firstly, there's the idea that your taste buds change as you get older, and you find yourself drifting towards darker and darker roasted coffees. I'm not sure that's the case, because I have a competing hypothesis here. I would say that the benchmarks for kind of typical coffee flavor are set in your relative youth. When you start drinking coffee, those kind of formative years of coffee drinking, set your expectations of what coffee can and should taste like. I think if you started drinking coffee 30 or 40 years ago, you were likely drinking darker roasts, you were not drinking light washed coffees, you were not drinking weird fermentations. That's not a familiar coffee flavor to you. And I think what you start drinking is probably what you keep drinking for a lot of your life, because that's the thing that you learned to like. I think if you start drinking coffee today, your idea, your expectation of coffee's flavor is going to be so much wider. You're going to be much more accepting of extremely fermented and unusual coffees because they've kind of always been there as an option since you started drinking coffee. That, I think, is my sort of theoretical proposed explanation of this particular data, but it definitely fit with my experience of the world, which is older people like darker roasted coffee, but I think the why is still to be explored and definitely super interesting. Remember when we talked about people's sort of coffee expertise and ranking themselves? Well, if you break down their preferences by their expertise level, you see something I think fascinating. First thing that I want to remark upon is that the people who ranked themselves 1 had the kind of most equally split preferences of the coffees. And it sort of implies that certain preferences develop over time. And certainly if you look at this data, you would say the deeper into coffee you get, the more you enjoy both fermented coffees and the more you enjoy lighter roasts, to a point. Because it looks like once you get to sort of a self-ranking of 8 out of 10, that is peak appreciation of fermented flavors. And then what we see in people who rank themselves 9 and 10 is a decrease in preference for fermented flavors and a small increase in preference for sort of washed coffees. This, I worry, totally fits into my sort of lived experience of the coffee industry as a whole. I've worked in coffee for maybe 20 years now. I know a lot of people who fell in love with fermented coffees, with natural coffees quite early in their career, loved them, and then for a variety of reasons get to the point where they just don't really enjoy them as much anymore. I know lots of coffee professionals who are kind of industry veterans who just don't want to drink naturally processed coffees. I am totally potentially making the data fit my lived experience here. But it is interesting kind of data to look at. Obviously, by the time we're ranking, an expertise out of 10 out of 10, that's a much smaller subset here. So the numbers involved are relatively small, which does skew your data. But it just was interesting to see that, your appreciation climbs and climbs and climbs until a point, and then it kind of stops and it does not continue to grow the same way. That I thought was worth looking at, mentioning, if only to talk about how people in the coffee industry get kind of weird in a particular way over time. A couple of quick ones that I think are just interesting. If you look at the breakdown of coffee favorite by how you brew coffee for yourself, you'll see that the pour-over drinkers strongly prefer lighter roasted coffees, and unsurprisingly, latte drinkers prefer the sort of medium and dark roasted coffees in comparison. I mean, pour-over really has a very strong preference towards coffee D, those kind of fermented flavors, but also a pretty big preference towards coffee A, that washed Kenyan coffee. It doesn't kind of carry through the whole way. You don't see in espresso drinkers or kind of shorter milk drinkers a preference for medium or dark roasted coffees. Actually, in this particular data set, probably a little bit more towards the light end. But, I don't know if the idea that your drink of choice is a good reflection of who you are is really, shown in this data. I think that was something we talked about or was joked about for a long time, like you are your coffee order. I'm not sure we're seeing that strongly in this data. Now I want to talk about stated preference versus revealed preference. We asked people what kind of taste descriptor words they like in their coffee. Did those descriptors match up with the particular coffees that exhibited those flavors? And I would say the answer is yes. People who selected fruity as a choice very strongly preferred coffee D and then coffee A. People who liked chocolatey mostly preferred the medium roast and the dark roast. And so, I think those kind of words turn out to correlate really surprisingly well to the kind of taste experience. We've talked negatively often as an industry about taste descriptors being kind of useless or, pretentious or confusing or frustrating. But I think when you use the big, broad category ones, they mean something to people, and people do know that they like fruity, they know that they like chocolatey, they know that they like nutty or bright. Those kind of words really strongly correlate with coffees that I would say exhibit those taste characteristics. But when we come to roast level as a descriptor, the correlation goes a little bit wonky here in an interesting way. And yes, people who said they like light roasted coffees in this did show a preference for coffees A and D, the light roasted coffees. However, people who said they like medium roasted coffees, well, their most popular coffee was actually the dark roasted coffee. And people who said they like dark roasted coffee, well, their most popular coffee was the medium roasted coffee. And I think it's not that surprising because medium and dark are very fuzzy words these days in the coffee landscape. Specialty medium to some people is still quite light. Specialty dark might be to some people medium. It's not a very helpful word to use, and it actually doesn't correlate as neatly and as strongly as you might hope. In an ideal world, I think a little bit of a dark roasted coffee in the tasting sort of kit might have worked better to split that out, but I can't help but feel that medium and dark are not that helpful as words, as guidance words, as selecting words, as preference words in the coffee world right now. Now it's time to wrap this up, and I should, I think, criticize this project to some extent because I want to think about how it could be done better in the future. Firstly, I think 5,000 kits was the kind of limit logistically for this particular project in the time frame that we had. I wish we had been able to do more, and I know a lot of people were frustrated that they couldn't take part, and I apologize. It's hard to really know the sort of level of demand for these kind of things, but 5,000 kits yielding 4,000 answers is an enormous amount of data, but I'd love 8,000, 12,000 responses, just to kind of broaden it a little bit more and kind of broaden it outside of the reach of the channel, specifically into a kind of wider population. Ultimately, this first and foremost was just supposed to be a really fun tasting experience. I think a lot of us had fun doing it. I thank all of you that took part, that tasted along with me, that shared the data that you did, that allowed us to kind of have this insight. I'm extremely grateful to all of you. I'm very grateful we got to do some citizen science, and I get to share these results with you. I should be clear, this data is open access. There will be a CSV file of every response, anonymized obviously, available to download in the description down below. Anyone can look at it. If you find some really interesting data in there, please leave a comment. But yes, I'm grateful that that data is available. It's open access. It should be fun to just kind of have a look through. I'll just warn you, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's like 4,000 rows deep. There's a lot of columns going on too. It's a big spreadsheet. Thank you also again to Cometier for doing all of the hard work and legwork on this. The logistics on this is no mean feat for this many sort of kits, and also crunching the data afterwards. For people who tried the coffees and want more, there is a discount code in the description down below. That gives you, I think, $20 off your order if you want to try it. So thank you to Cometier. And lastly, thank you. If you've thoughts on this, if there's things you think we should look at in the data, if there's any insights that you want to share, if you took part and want to share your experience with it, I would love to hear from you down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.